Welcome to the Rio Hondo Gallery. Today we have Marischa, and she is our artist currently with her solo show, Across the Floors of the Silent Seas. Thank you, and thank you for coming in today.
Oh, you're welcome.
I've been really excited about this show, and I really want to start out by thanking you for your generosity towards our students, spending so much time talking to the different classes. They've really got a lot out of your talks with them, and we're going to continue with this. So I'd like to start off by saying thank you.
Well, you're welcome. The
Now,
students were amazing.
we were very fortunate to have such lovely students, and we have this wonderful show. And the show is kind of really exciting for me because, one, it's our first official show back in the college gallery during this time, that we've all been kind of dealing with the pandemic.
Hmm.
And it's been really exciting to reopen officially with your show. Let's go into a little bit about you. One
Okay.
of the things I love is your background. And then I'm going to just give a quick little plug and then let you talk a little more. Um, you're from the United States, Colorado, I believe. And then you've lived in places like London, and your career as an artist has been quite incredible. You've shown not only quite a bit locally, but internationally, having shows in London and doing projects and shows in Beijing, Vietnam. You've shown with great galleries locally in LA. You're now an LA artist with like Robert Berman. Um, let's talk a little bit about how you got into art and sort of how you got here.
Well, it's an interesting story because I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in the suburbs, and my mom and dad were super strict and religious, and they grew up in second and third generation families that were still basically immigrant families because they still spoke their ancestral tongue. Like my mom didn't even speak English until she was over 6 years old. And so they lived on farms in the Dakotas and in Nebraska. And then they migrated to the city and had us girls. And they worked really hard, but there was no foundation in my background for becoming a successful artist. We had no um, access to museums. We didn't go to museums. We didn't have any access to contemporary art. We didn't know, I had no foundation uh, to figure out how to be an artist. But I just drew and painted all the time. I do crazy things, much to my parents' chagrin, like half animal, half rabbit creatures that were in various stages of undress. And my parents were just blown away. And I wasn't allowed to become an art major. I had to become a journalism major. And I went to a small state college in northern Colorado. And it wasn't really a small state college, but it was a state college in northern Colorado, mostly known for its agricultural and veterinary schools. But I became a journalism major.
Now, so you went to school for journalism,
Yeah.
but from talking to you, I understand you started taking art classes and kind of sort of rediscover your love, for art again.
I was always going to be an artist. I was always the most curious person I knew about art. I was always like, art is a three-letter word, and there's a lot of space in between each letter. I wanted just to be an artist. But because I grew up in this really strict environment where I had to get a job after college, I had to juggle being a journalism major with spending all my nights in the printmaking studio. And so when I think about it, I am pretty much self-taught. I had to be my own North Star, in effect. I had to, you know, follow my own path. And that was really helpful because it created the trajectory that I'm on.
Now, you went from that small town
Yeah.
And then I believe you moved to LA
I did.
and you started your career as an artist here in LA.
Mhm.
And then you sort of ran off to, I believe, London
Yeah.
and became a curator, an artist. So let's, before we get into the artwork and the show, it's kind of a fun for our viewers to know about how this all happened and how you became the artist you are now.
Well, I did start showing with Robert Berman. He saw something in me. Great guy. To know him is to love him. And I then started having shows first in Amsterdam, and then I was that plucky girl from the suburbs of Denver to get on a plane to Bangkok and show at my friend's complex in Bangkok, where he had a lesbian disco, a sex toy emporium, but a really great gallery in addition to that. So I got on the cover of Bangkok Metro magazine as Artist of the Year. How crazy is that? From there, I moved to London and did this photographic tableau show of large-scale photographs with a collaborator, a brilliant photographer named Claire Barron. And we did some old-timey scrim analog tableau photographs that featured taxidermy squirrels and clay creatures and like sci-fi vegetables we got at the Bangladeshi markets down the street. This is on Brick Lane. So I go to the most like difficult town in the world without an MFA, without going to Goldsmiths, without checking off the boxes that is important in England. And I had all this jank bravado, and I didn't know it was jank bravado. I didn't know I was being like outlandish and like, oh my God, look at that American girl. But I just kept going, and I got us 2 solo shows, and I got us 2 group shows and a bunch of press. And then I started my own gallery there, which I asked the people I lived above who owned a hair salon, can I have a gallery in your basement? And they said, yeah, sure, because they loved me. And it was called Underbelly. So we showed a lot of local artists in Shoreditch and Hoxton. And we had like film festivals and art fusion type things. And it was really happening. It was really happening. And then I kind of got kicked out of the country. But yeah, so that was my London thing.
And as well, that was the next thing is, so, you know, I knew everything was going so well, you know, so you ended up back in LA. You know, I was going to say what brought you back, but now we really know what brought you back.
I overstayed my welcome. I could have, there was a couple of ways I could have stayed there, but it was time to come back.
You came back, you're sort of on this great trajectory in London. And how did you find coming back, you know, to LA and starting your career again, starting it back up in LA at that time?
Well, I had a body of photographic work, and I had a lot of paintings. I was doing representational art at that point, solely like these deformed creatures in the woods, basically. I was doing a lot of commissions. I was sad not to be in London anymore, and 9/11 happened right after I got back from London. So it was a strange time to be in the US and to, you know, carry on. But I got an amazing studio, and I traded 1 painting a year for this studio. As, you know, a struggling artist, I was only selling paintings, but I was making a living. Scraping and begging and doing things like that, you know, subsidizing my rent by talking my landlord into trading a painting for a year. I stayed at that studio for 9 years, and that ended up being like, you know, the springboard for all the other things that happened to me in LA and all the things that happened to me in other parts, like in San Francisco. I had a show in Chicago, I had a show in Cologne. So, you know, I kept going back and forth from Asia and Europe to the US, and I kept getting on those planes, without any money or anything, just figuring it out as I went along, but selling paintings too, somehow.
Well, no, that's what it's about, is selling our artwork, you know. And so many of our peers that we go have to have day jobs, and that sort of relieves. I guess I find it fascinating because, in a sense, it relieves the pressure having that day job of like always having to worry about paying the rent and doing that. But sometimes, doing this and talking to a lot of artists, it can also be difficult to make the artwork. Did you find it more freeing that you could just sit in your studio and make artwork, or was the pressure to do all that a struggle to figure out?
Well, before I figured it all out how to sell paintings and make a living making paintings, and I was having shows overseas, I had a number of what I call gold bricking jobs. So basically, I was hired to work in a position using my journalism degree and my advertising background and my public relations cognate to get jobs at big companies where I didn't have any supervision. And it was a job where I really didn't have to do anything, but nobody knew that. So I would paint all night, and I'd come to the office and lock the door and fall asleep on the floor and sleep the night off, and no one knew. One of the companies I worked for was Philips. Sorry, Philips, but I screwed you over, kind of.
It's that they helped develop your artwork.
They helped develop my artwork, and that's all I cared about. I was determined, and I would do anything to become a full-time artist. So,
well, and I know over the last several years, following your career, you've done well, but you also have done. It's interesting because we're going to get into the show. You have been just right up to the show, artist known for portraits and biomorphic work.
yes,
And then the pandemic hits.
right.
And
Right.
I find it fascinating. And I really love to see the show because a lot of artists, I feel, when they look back and you ask this question, like, what did you do over the pandemic? This was when we were locked up for a year. Did people make work? And one of the great things, when we talked about the show, and I really thank you because it was touch and go. I mean, right away I said, hey, I want to do the show, but we could be closed down at,
Right.
We were closed down, but they could shut me down permanently. We could be open this month and close the next month. So you went into creating a huge body of new work for a show that we weren't 100% sure was actually going to be able to happen.
But I mean, if just backing up a little, this was my first show that was entirely abstract. So, and that all started from some hand stenciled large paintings that were just backgrounds that were sitting in storage for a long time. I had those, and then I did these car wash photos, just holding my phone up in front of my windshield and taking pictures of the drive-through car wash and augmenting them in my camera using digital camera apps. Just no filter politeness. I didn't even care. I was just getting these things printed and selling them. And then the pandemic hit. And I was like, so despondent. My husband was an emergency doctor, and when he left for work, it was his second career. He didn't sign up to be an older doctor during a pandemic. He'd leave in the morning, and the look on his face was like 10 years older. And we both thought we were going to die. Nobody knew what was going on. I mean, I ate the same can of soup, split pea soup, Anderson split pea soup with bacon flavoring. Sorry. Just need to throw that out there because it's a little product placement. I just ate the same thing every day. And then I started teaching a class. I got the offer to teach this class at Visual Arts Lab where, it met the moment. It was a Zoom class And everybody in the class did something different. People made jewelry, people were textile makers, people were like painters like me, people did oil paintings, people did watercolors, people were illustrators. And being around these, it was all women over 40, and it was these being around these women and seeing what they were doing and knowing how I wanted to work with materials so bad, using crazy types of materials. I mean, that's what I always wanted to do, was make abstract art and use, both machine made and handmade materials and combine them, both digital and analog. And so I started researching, and I found make your own pepperoni gun on the internet. And I started watching these tutorials of like hunters who went out and like made their own pepperoni out of, I don't know what, wild boar or venison or something. So I got that, and that's how I made these little worms and these little centipede type creatures, and or the black painting, which is more of a sausage casing painting, or make your own jerky. And as I was doing that, I was also using frosting tubes with mostly Russian piping tips. I was just really excited about all different ways. I was like a mad scientist trying to figure out how to push paint out of something. Like the formula had to be right, the color had to be right, the gel, the body of the paint had to be right. And that's when I started getting the idea for the show, Across the Floors of Silent Seas, because I felt like these were creatures that were at the very bottom of the sea, scuttling around like fluorescent crabs and hiding in mysterious crevices. And you pull back the rock and you'd see this like vibrant, fluorescent and phosphorescent worm or mollusk, or this bed of like pearlescent oysters. And it was just really interesting to me because I did a lot of scuba diving. So it was like I was deep sea diving, and then that was really the metaphor. I was sort of unearthing, deep sea diving into the past and the future and into my own soul, which sounds a little bit over the top, but I was unearthing all this stuff during COVID, where everybody else was painting like dark and political stuff and kind of sad and depressing stuff. I just wanted to use color and paint and just have it be joyous and riotous and make myself happy.
Well, that's one of the things I found fascinating was in our conversations, and especially when I do studio visits, there is so much, whether it's politics, whether it's the COVID, that anger and art. And you went in such an interesting direction with sort of bright pastel colors and glitter, and the layering's insane. I mean, we have paintings that have 37 layers.
Yeah, it was a grind, I'm telling you, but it was the glorious grind of, art when you finally got down to that last layer. I constructed these large format paintings, partly digital, partly just handmade or in my brain. And I made different layers. So I stuck to my goal. So I used all these hand stenciled paintings that I had made in the past, and I pulled them out of storage because they were just backgrounds to me. And I started layering things on top of it and using things I hadn't used before. Like I have 2 stencil cutting machines, so it was like machine made, and then I was hand painting, so it was handmade, and spray paint and airbrushing and taping, and it was physical, and it was traumatic and romantic all at the same time. And I, was thrilled at how they turned out, the large scale paintings. I'd never done anything like these paintings.
Well, one of the things I love about the show is the relationship between the different materials you're using. whether it's the photography, whether it's using paint as literally coming out of like sausage tubes or jerky machines, or on your pastel between the pastel and the white, sort of layered paintings, which really is almost a ceramic technique.
It does look like ceramic. You said that before. I love that.
And then your paintings that have sort of this handcraft, I mean, you're using handcraft techniques, digital, it almost has a folk quality to it, but it's a very also graphic sort of design quality to it. And it's sort of a big breakaway, but they all flow together. And as an artist, and I know I mentioned this before talking to classes, and I'd love your sort of response, where a lot of artists, and I do believe the art world's changing a little bit, where it's that sort of joke like, oh yes, I only paint in oil, or I'm a watercolorist. And but you were known as kind of this, renderer, painter that could break out like this and then explore materials. And especially growing up with those sort of views of like, you have to be a ceramicist or you have to be an acrylic painter, and this is the type of work. To How did you find the freedom to do that
Oh,
and the ability to do that?
well, I mean, I I think a lot of it was the benefit, and this is going to sound weird, of being in a single occupancy studio, not having to worry about COVID, because I was all alone. I had a lot of paint and I had a lot of canvases that I hadn't used. I had been just laying in bed watching Netflix. So I had all this time to figure out different kinds of machines and materials that I was going to use. And I didn't have any fear of missing out. I didn't have any, it was just, you only make art. That's what you do. That's your job now. That's your job during the pandemic, is to only make art. So I didn't have to worry about, oh, I have to go to that lunch with that person with all the food allergies. I don't really want to go to that lunch. Or I don't really want to go to that gallery opening. And there weren't any gallery openings. So it was just really freeing because there was a lot of experimentation. There was a lot of failures. Some of the failures worked. I figured out how to make those failures into great things. But, there was a lot of back and forth. And it was okay because no one was judging me. There was no studio visits. There's nothing.
Did it just come up on its own, or were there influence? I know your title comes from, a famous author, but how did that sort of happen for you? Was it just the pandemic that clicked it in, or was there an event that sort of, I need to do this? Because that's a big breakaway.
Well, I was already doing, I'd already had the idea to do these pedal, where I would put use palette knives and do sort of these shell-like or petals onto freezer paper or wax paper, and then let them sit there and dry. And then once they were dry, you could peel them up. It was so awesome because it was like peeling off scabs after scabs. And then gluing them onto the canvas individually, I could control the composition, like to a T, because I could use them or not use them. And then I would glue them onto the canvas. But while I was waiting for them to dry, I needed something else to work on. And that's when I started on these. And am I answering your question correctly?
Yes, I mean, that's kind of there. Were there any outside influences also that's sort of the process? Like, was there anything happening? I mean, like you said, you're watching a lot of Netflix, you're reading a lot. Was there anything that sort of exciting that kicked it in, or did it just sort of just flow in the studio?
At that point, I wasn't really using any social media as part of my studio practice, but I know so many amazing artists. And one thing I really was not jealous of, but had such a fervent desire to do, was to find tools to push out paint, was to find different ways of using paint, was to figure out how to spray, was figure out how to use my airbrush, which I hadn't used for like years, was to just reinvigorate my knowledge of materials that I had kind of used, but not really, because I was doing representational art. I was able just to, but as far as influences for these paintings, I don't really know. I was just influenced by myself, really, and stuck to my plan and kept going.
Good. Now, with your plan, and you mentioned that before, with the plan. Now, some of these, and a lot of, especially the paintings, like we have the one behind me. I think it's 36 or 37 layers.
37 layers.
When you have 37 layers, when do you decide it's enough? How did you sort of get that plan that I'm going to just keep on layering, adding glitter, adding paint, adding cutouts, going back in with spray paint, going back in with different materials? How did you sort of
know when to stop?
Know when to stop, know when to take a break? How do you lay that out?
My whole thing about, well, a lot of these paintings were halfway designed by drawing and halfway designed by photoshopping ideas and halfway designed by using other programs. But there was no way that idea, that digital idea of what the painting could look like, would ever transfer to the canvas, because you can't get that kind of saturated, screen look on a digital look on a canvas. So when I got to places where I was struggling, I would just stop and I would just stare at, I would leave that painting and just stare at it for days until I figured out what to do. And I'm a really big believer of just staring at something. And then it comes to you.
Now, all your work has such wonderful titles, and I hope people get the chance to come up. Now, how big, a lot of artists, oh, this is Untitled 1, or this is, obviously, maybe it's the journalism background.
Thank you. I was just going to say.
How did that, it seems like, such a big part of your work, My Mother's Stolen Pearls, Unfurling Echoes of the Deep, these great titles for your pieces. How is that something, you sort of have an idea when you're creating the work? Does it come at the end? It seems like sort of the story that your titles have gives a sort of different insight into the paintings.
I always do the titles last, because then I can get the full scope of what they are and what I want them to be and the feeling they give off. They almost become like people in a weird way. But what I wanted to do with this show is, because, I was using a poet who's in the public domain, and the title was from his famous poem. And we're talking about T.S. Eliot, who, at the time, he was really influential to me. I didn't know he was kind of a bad person, but it really worked for my show, because he has a line in there: "I wish I was a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas." So then I thought, I want to do the titles in the cadence of old English poets like Wordsworth or Coleridge or something like that, and have a lot of consonants and alliteration and assonance. I want them to be sort of sing-songy, and some of them are and some of them aren't. My Mother's Stolen Pearls is obviously just or the Selkie Wedding Party is not got all that cadence or poetry or rhyme in it, or but I have a friend who lives in Wisconsin who we sort of play back and forth, because she loves to do titles, and I've been making titles with her for a long time. So we just had a riot. She helped me. I'd love to collaborate, and she helped me, and I helped her get her mind off. She's an editor. She edits really dirgy Russian literature, Russian history books. So it was just a lot of fun for both of us to go back and forth with, like, oh, this sounds better, oh, this sounds better, oh, this sounds better. So the naming of them is really about writing and being a writer as well as being an artist. So I love it. So, the deep sea wing siren nymphs prevail, you know, always had to be her. Deep sea wet dream, mollusk musks, liberate the oyster bed, luminous the night. It was just a lot of consonants and alliteration and cadence. And yeah.
That's so exciting. I mean, it's so fun to see language and art used in that way, as opposed to now where it's splattered on paintings. It's so much that to see the art and then to see the titles afterwards, at least for me, was a really beautiful thing and sort of gave a different sort of dimension to the work. Sometimes I like it and sometimes I don't, depending on the show, because sometimes for me, what my vision of the art, it's like anything, like what my vision versus what I see from the title. But I thought in this case, in your work, that the titles were such a wonderful part of your
Oh,
work.
thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
And I really enjoyed that. And I could see our students coming in, and they were very fascinated by the titles and the influence that had on them and hopefully on their work, which really hopefully will have a great impact on our kids here.
It does become another aspect. It does. I'm a little influenced by Leslie Sarr, the daughter of Betsy Sarr and the grandchild of Allison Sarr, because she uses actual lines of poetry and she attributes them to the poet as the titles for her pieces. And she's incredibly thoughtful about what she chooses. So I wanted these titles to be like more like poetry than like actual, one word titles, which you see a lot, or something kind of, there's a lot of artists that use imperceptible or, incongruous titles. And you're like, that's funny, but what does it mean? So I wanted them to speak to the work.
Now, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to ask this because it is such a different change in your work, from going from figurative to this. Now having a little time and a little perspective, how have you enjoyed this sort of journey that you went on?
Well, I'm going to do it for now, for as long as I want. I've always lived in many different directions, and I think we can do that now in this age that we're living in. I mean, influencers and people that build their brands, they create their own worlds, and they live either, in other words, I don't want to replicate myself, or I don't want to have a definitive style. I don't think we need to anymore. I mean, some people, yeah, it's a great way to build your brand, but I don't have to do that anymore. So I am just starting doing abstract work, and I will continue to do this because I just loved it. And I appreciate you letting me show it here for the first time ever, that people have seen my all abstract paintings.
Well, it's our honor, and it was such a pleasure to have your work at the gallery. And once again, your generosity to not only myself, but our students. I really got to thank you for that, and how much teachers have said they enjoyed your talks with the classes.
So great. Go on. Sorry.
Well, and now everybody gets to get a little bit of that as we got to do this.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
For our audience, once again, Across the Floors of the Silent Seas runs October 14th through November 18th. So if you're just seeing this now, you have plenty of time to get a chance to view it. So please, we will be posting your social media online so people can get an opportunity to see more of your wonderful work. this is just also not the full body of work you created. This is a large part of the work you created, but we couldn't get it all in. So there is more to see.
Yeah. You edited,
Well,
but you edited
yes.
well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, once again, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Grant Lenzel, our dean, who actually is making this happen, and Wendy and Abby, who have
Ah,
coordinated this. And once again, our president, who, in her wisdom, has allowed me to do this and our gallery to continue during these incredible times. So, thank you for coming out, and
and thank
thank
you so
you,
much, Robert.
for
It's
doing
been
this with us.
it's been thrilling.